And thank you, Jessica, for joining us today. We have Jessica, who's a little bit outside of the realm of wildlife, but she is such a unique and fantastic speaker that we just could not pass up this opportunity. Jessica Chapman is a fellow with ALDF's Criminal Justice Program. She works with the department to address crimes against animals and partners with stakeholders across the criminal justice system to resolve the impact of animal cruelty. She is also a recently appointed adjunct professor with the University of Pittsburgh School of Law. So thank you so much for joining us, Jessica.
Thanks for having me, Kim. Everyone, thanks for having me. I know I'm a frequent attendee of these meetings, so it's not as formal. I'm going to share my screen now. And also, I have a lot of practice doing this presentation very quickly. So with that, I apologize in advance if, sorry, of course, the thing isn't there. Okay, I apologize in advance if it seems like I've missed anything in this presentation, but I can say, and I guess I'm proud to say that I am proud, but not trying to toot my own horn. My full publication on this topic was just published with the Manitoba Law Journal. So if you'd like a deeper dive into this, you can read it there. So this presentation is going to focus on kind of looking at animal cruelty in a different way and finding out if there's a way to curb animal cruelty or even resolve the roots of it through looking at the person who has committed animal cruelty in the first place and looking at their background and their experience. As everyone, as I'm sure, has a lot of experience in realizing that animal cruelty and the things that we do to animals are not an animal problem, they are truly a human problem. And so if we can work with the humans that are committing that cruelty, then it stops becoming an issue for the animals who are affected by it. So to provide context to this, trauma particularly, which is the focus of my work, but also it leads and bleeds into other mental health and social work perspectives, is prevalent throughout the population, but particularly among people who have committed animal cruelty, as well as who engage in antisocial or criminal behavior. This slide just really quickly kind of explains that and illustrates it. To note, the vast majority of the United States population, at least, so 70% of adults have experienced trauma at least once in their life. And that doesn't have to just be, being abused or having, interpersonal violence. That could also be something like being involved in a car accident or vicarious trauma of watching somebody be mistreated, but something that has change the trajectory of their emotions so that they cannot handle the reaction that they had from an event that has taken away their power and control. Interestingly, a lot of people who have mental health issues like schizophrenia and bipolar disorder are actually individuals that have had an extremely traumatic event happen in their life. And those types of mental health issues have either been created by or exacerbated by trauma. PTSD is one of those predominant mental health concerns. But sadly, a lot of people who seek treatment for PTSD or trauma-induced mental health issues are never actually diagnosed for trauma. And so that means that there are so many mental health issues that happen that are not recognized as having been trauma-derived. And so they're not actually being treated for what would really help them in the first place. Oftentimes, if you can resolve the trauma or the symptoms of trauma, then everything else will follow. But unfortunately, that carries on into populations of individuals who've committed cruelty and then also wind up in our carceral system. And so here are just some percentages, but there are quite a large number of people who identify as men and women, and I apologize that I don't have the percentages on people who have a different identification. Those studies didn't have that information available. But from this more meager set of statistics, the vast majority actually of people that are incarcerated have experienced either serious or moderate mental health, particularly PTSD, which is a disparate comparison to the general population of people who have experienced trauma or PTSD and trauma-derived mental health illnesses. So, 20% severe, 50 to 75% moderate, and who are incarcerated, compared to 3 to 6% of at least the general male population that are not incarcerated who have trauma. Unfortunately, carceral sentences don't do anything. It's kind of like putting a cupcake in an oven. It just makes things grow, and it makes mental health issues worse. So anything that happens without necessary treatment is just ticking time bomb in a way, and it will just the issues that people had when they went into the carceral experience are going to leave with worse experiences, and they still haven't gotten the help they need. On top of that, there's the stereotype that I think we're all very aware of, even if it may not be true, that the people who want to defend animals are constantly trying to put people in prison away, or I'm sorry, people who've committed cruelty in prison. And so for that, there are these two stormy situations that are coming where the people who've committed cruelty towards animals have obviously committed an atrocity, but are sometimes stereotyped as only being called an offender and not being seen for who they are beyond the cruelty they've committed. And so on top of that, and this idea that perhaps some people want to impose carceral sentences, these people are kind of falling into a void and are not being looked at as people that could actually have a strong level of participation in their own healing and preventing future violence if they got the necessary treatment they needed by being recognized as survivors from traumatic events in the past. So to further this point, William Hogarth was this gentleman who created these 4 stages of cruelty, and it's essentially the graduation hypothesis, where somebody was small and as a boy hurt other boys or other animals, and then that eventually levels up to committing murder of his wife. And then stage 4 is a showing of the oppression that happens with society, then using retributive justice to hurt Tom Nero by executing him. And so the cycle just continues to repeat itself, but it doesn't ask the question about what were those first experiences that even led to the influence of Tom Nero to commit that violence. And that's what I want to get into. If we can find a way to find that stage 0, that root cause, perhaps we can help this cycle end, or at least curb it significantly. So this is just a brief life cycle of trauma. If you have a traumatic event, it then is not taken care of, either because people don't recognize that the trauma and the symptoms are there, or people aren't able to get the help they need. It develops into PTSD most frequently. That untreated PTSD creates symptoms that skew a person's world, their view of the world, themselves and others. It takes away this feeling of power and control and this self-agency, this sense of agency. Through that, those exacerbated symptoms create more mental illness. And then the only way that people feel like they can manage these feelings and these internal battles and emotions within themselves is by finding other ways to maintain power and control, which becomes a survival mechanism and really self-preservation rather than something that seems to everyone else is intentional. And that is at the point where animals come in or other humans come in that are vulnerable compared to the person who's committing these atrocities. At this point, they are asserting the same type of trauma on new victims or repeated victims, because it gives them the sense of agency that they're trying to regain that they first lost. Unfortunately, at this point, though, the cycle repeats itself because you've introduced new victims into it, and they don't have an understanding of what's going on to them, these internal emotions or feelings, and then they start having this need to also maintain power and control because this their diagnosed or their undiagnosed trauma symptoms exist, or they may also be diagnosed and it's just they're not being handled as in a healthy way. To that point, though, and as I mentioned earlier, there are different types of trauma that come, and this is I'm not the only person who's made this argument, and I've read several experts' opinions about this after I made this point. So it was original at the time, but I don't think it's as original now because there are quite a few other people that are in the social world that have made this point. But cruelty and trauma can come through a lot of different ways, especially with animals. It can either be the person has experienced the cruelty firsthand, or they can see that violence being done either to humans or animals. The part that gets a little bit more tangential is that there are ways in which we treat animals that are societally accepted that also create trauma. You see that a lot with people that are involved in the slaughterhouse industry. They're the people who actually are the workers who have to pull the bodies apart, have higher rates of domestic abuse and interpersonal violence. And it's an experience, it's an example of showing that having to be part of the destruction of other beings, even if it's socially accepted, is something that does create trauma on the body and is also a form of abuse because you're watching violence being done to another human being. This could also extend to the research industries, entertainment, retail, as well as things that we have held dear to our hearts, not us personally necessarily, but our society. So hunting, specific types of cuisine, all of this comes into play a picture of violence that oftentimes doesn't get recognized as such because it is so socially accepted. But then what happens is if it does create trauma on a human being, they don't understand where that trauma is coming from or why they're having a reaction because everybody is condoning them. And so that trauma and the subsequent PTSD may elevate into being undiagnosed and become serious mental health illnesses that then may underlie the reasons that they may commit cruelty in the future, either towards humans or to animals. The approach that I'm looking at is really finding a way of moving beyond retributive justice, not doing the eye for an eye, but really combining restorative justice and transformative justice. In order to be able to protect animals and human victims, we really need to find a way to protect the defending parties as well. In their victim status. Absolutely, they need to be held accountable for what they do. This is not an excuse or an apology for their actions, and all victims and communities need to be restored. But if we can combine the aspects of restorative justice that repair the victims in the communities, and then find a method of helping the people who committed animal cruelty become more than they were before they committed the cruelty, really transform into reaching their highest potential, then they have an understanding of what their actions were, why they happened, and be able to be introspective in a safe way so that they can heal and then become advocates for those that are more vulnerable to them versus using them as methods of trying to regain power and control in an unhealthy way. So what that would look like in our judicial system is that we have to have more than just incarceration or punishment. And I know a lot of us are really moving beyond that idea, but I think it's something important to show is that incarceration without any other support is not, it doesn't work. There have been studies that have shown it doesn't work, that it makes the circumstances worse, and particularly with people with mental health issues. Psychological evaluations that don't include trauma diagnoses are also not helpful. Oftentimes psychological evaluations are, they're either searching for a certain diagnosis, or they may not be done by somebody who is just in the right expertise to be able to understand the full picture of a person, and they often don't include trauma at all, and so that's completely misdiagnosed. So you have people that have bipolar disorder or schizophrenia without anything else, but that connection needs to exist, that there may have been factors that led to those mental health illnesses, particularly with PTSD. That doesn't just come from anywhere. And then including that the psychological treatment needs to have trauma-informed therapy as well, if trauma exists. A lot of people who have substance abuse issues or other commit other comorbid offenses have shown to have trauma in addition to other circumstances. And so SAMHSA is a really good example of using trauma-informed therapy to heal the people that have these underlying instances of trauma that then save themselves from substance abuse. And so we're basically using that same approach, but for animal cruelty. Luckily for us, people who have been survivors of different types of violence, particularly interpersonal violence, sexual assaults, they have been using these different types of therapy that are specific for trauma and PTSD. Two of them are cognitive processing therapy and eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. These programs are great because studies have shown that talk therapy, longstanding talk therapy, doesn't actually work for people with PTSD. It actually re-triggers those events and doesn't help people move past them, turn them into long ago memories and move on. Whereas cognitive processing therapy and eye movement desensitization and reprocessing are finite programs. They work to identify the trauma, resolve what created that trauma in the first place, as well as those symptoms. And so if we can take these individuals who've created these initial offenses, see that, you know, whether they did actually have trauma, and then identify that trauma, then their symptomatic responses of trying to hurt animals hopefully would be alleviated, because the trauma has been identified, which was really the whole reason for taking that action. Obviously, there are different circumstances. There are very much many people who commit atrocities towards animals that don't have trauma, and so this wouldn't apply to them, and everybody's circumstances are unique. But trauma is so prevalent in society that this might be a really good step towards resolving those issues. And the great part is that these are both really short programs, 12 weeks and 8 weeks, and you can actually shorten their lengths as well if people are successful. The cognitive processing therapy really allows the person to be introspective and think about what's happening in their lives. Whereas the EMDR, if people don't want to communicate and they don't feel safe to do so, allows people to just use their bodies to process the emotions and think in the moment with their therapist. So if you're putting in that trauma-informed therapy into the cruelty life cycle, essentially that after the mental illness development has occurred, you insert the CPT or EMDR or customized healing for the individual, and then the hypothesis is that it really does resolve those symptoms and curb that mental illness. It does change skewed perspectives, and there's this sense of peace and the ability to be able to coexist without having to maintain power and control in a way that hurts others. My publication talks about potentially using research, completely voluntary research, to see if this would actually work. In order to do research, we would want to identify individuals who have been convicted of animal cruelty, or people that may not have been caught or convicted, but know that they've done it. We would screen for traumatic events in their lives, see if they do actually have trauma, and people who are victims of trauma, before they get admitted into trauma-informed programs, have to take a survey that actually rates how bad their trauma is, or if it's below the threshold to receive treatment. So people who've been convicted of animal cruelty or in those different groups would go through that survey as well. This also allows people who've committed cruelty to really not only be clients and participants, but be leaders in a way to transform themselves and the lives of others that they know or that they may not know, but who are in similar circumstances. And then we could see if this type of therapy actually works, and find a way to not only bring it to people who are incarcerated, but also in community outlets, similar to what you would see with an Alcoholics Anonymous program, where people have the ability to heal and continue that healing once they've returned into a world that might have had triggers prior to their therapy. It has to be completely voluntary, just as victims who go through these trauma-informed programs come on their own. People who've committed cruelty would need to come on their own as well. Studies have shown that forced enrollment for therapy doesn't work. But I strongly believe that people do get to a point where they're just tired of hurting and being angry, and so that it may take a little bit longer for to enroll the number of people that would create a legitimate study. But in doing that, you have real results rather than things that are being fabricated. This would also give broader support to creating programs within the carceral experience as well as post-carceral programs. And then finding deeper research or more customized circumstances and approaches that help people, and being able to listen to the very people that it's affecting and finding out how we can change and better the research to benefit them and everyone else that was around them that they affected. There are obviously recognized challenges, particularly funding. However, there are quite a few grants that have been offered for trauma-informed work. And so I don't think that that is something that is as big of an uphill battle as it seems. Some of the benefits of using trauma-informed therapy, particularly CPT and EMDR, are that they transcend cultural, language, and socioeconomic differences. These programs have been used in other countries because you're dealing with the emotions. Just like cruelty is cruelty objectively throughout the country and throughout the world, trauma is also trauma throughout the world. All humans have, the similar blood and guts and emotions and thoughts. And so these programs are designed to transcend cultural differences and linguistic differences, to be able to get to the root of those emotions and those feelings, so that the actions that hurt others, which also transcend cultural differences. And there's a really great success rate for these different programs. Several studies have been done on EMDR specifically, but also CPT, that show that the people that have undergone certain weeks of the program are free of PTSD. And this also is a really great multidisciplinary approach to bring the mental health and social work fields in, which is all really what we need for any type of, I think, legal system to be successful that deals with mental health, is bringing in those three fields to work together rather than working in silos. Of course, we need the entire court system on board for this. Prosecution, defense, and judges need to be open to it, and mental health professionals and social work professionals need to be open to this, with the idea of integrating trauma more into their work, and seeing the person who's committed the cruelty, while definitely maintaining accountability, but being a person that has the ability to change. Again, not everyone is in that circumstance, but I think there are more people than we give credit to. The choice to go into these types of therapy programs could be implemented into diversion programs or other alternatives, perhaps hand in hand with human education programs and community service programs, and hopefully, the miracle of giving funding to prisons that actually benefit individuals, but providing therapy in prisons and state jails as well. It also incorporates restorative justice and transformative justice, which are hot issues. And then you can, just as CAP laws and other animal advocate laws have been put into place, these could be legislative opportunities that provide a broader voice for people that have committed cruelty, but also victims and communities, because it does restore those individuals and populations in the end as well. Last but not least, the experience of using trauma-informed work could go toward really so many different oppressed and marginalized populations, recognizing each individual within their unique circumstances, their socioeconomic backgrounds, their trauma backgrounds, their ethnic and racial backgrounds, and how those experiences have also created trauma. But that's another discussion that's very important, but for another time. And so you could implement this just in your own backyard with houseless communities, indigenous communities. I work a lot within tribal law and tribal nations, and there's so much trauma in the world and within their lives that this would be really applicable. And then also mainstream communities, ones that may not seem like they have a problem, but there's a lot of animal cruelty that happens under our noses. So really anything to be able to curb that cruelty and advocate for animals in a holistic way, you could use this work to apply that to. I know we're out of time, but feel free to email me if you have any questions. Again, that publication is on the Manitoba Law Journal's website. With the most recent volume, and I think it's like issue 5, but the citations are in there, and I'm happy to talk more should you have any questions later. Thank you.
Wow, thank you so much, Jessica. Does anyone have, I know we are at time, but does anyone have any questions? That was a fantastic and powerful presentation, so I appreciate you. Thank you.
That was just not a question, but it's so informative and positive. It's really wonderful to hear about that work. Thank you, Jessica.
My pleasure. Thank you. It's always a gamble of whether or not people will receive it, because it's just a little different, but I appreciate that.
Okay, well, thank you, Jessica, and thanks everyone for a great meeting. We will see you next month. Take care, everyone.
Thanks, Alex.